Welcome back to the Seaboard Central, everyone, in part 9 in the Realistic Ops series. I'm just testing out the new trackage, the fuel pad in Gadsden Yard, and there's a lot of details I need to add and I hope to have finished before the next update. But so far, everything seems to be working fine. So in today's video, I had originally planned to talk about routing guides for my locals, but I believe I'm going to postpone that till next week and instead talk about supply chain logistics. It seems that I had a lot of questions on the last video and I want to hopefully clear everything up and give people more of an idea of how rail cars move throughout the rail network. So if that seems interesting to you, keep watching. And if you enjoy the video, as always, I appreciate a thumbs up. It definitely helps the YouTube algorithm. So without further ado, let's get started. So what actually is supply chain logistics? And this is definitely a much simplified version of how I'm going to describe this, but this definitely applies to the rail industry. And let's say you have a producer, Industry A, that produces a product that's loaded to Industry B. So you have point A and point B where the loaded move makes. And then the car is empty and they return back to point A. That is referred to as the cycle time, and it's normally associated with unit trains, like unit coal trains or unit grain trains, where the entire train moves from point A to point B without having to be switched or classified en route. But it also can apply to, say, for example, turning locomotives at one end of the run. That can be the cycle time, how long it takes to refuel, resand the locomotives to go back to where they came from. And it could talk about single car shipments too. So these cycle times vary. They could be pretty quick depending on the type of load that's in the car. Definitely a perishable car, hauling a perishable load, will want to be moved to the customer and unloaded before the product goes bad. But there's loads like plastic pellets that may stay for months at the industry before they're actually released to go back to the origin. So this is considered the cycle time in supply chain logistics. So in Realistic Ops Part 8, I was talking about how I determine how many cars I'm going to need for a particular service. So say, for example, the DDG cars that are coupled to the ADM switcher here. And in the Realistic Ops Part 8, I said that I needed 12 cars for this service. So let's look again at that paperwork. So looking again at ADM for the DDG move, we see we had 4 cars on hand, 2 at the destination, 2 in the yard, 2 on L83, and 2 on L68 for a total of 12. So one of the questions was, what do these 2 in the yard represent? Let me explain. So let's look at this actual ADM DDG move, because ADM has a contract with the southern states to supply the cars, 2 loads of DDG that they require. So this is a snapshot, basically, of what everything looks like at any given moment. So for example, you could have 2 cars that are loaded and ready to be pulled, and 2 empty cars that are on hand. Just consider these 2 empties as surplus. And this is just in case this train is late. The plant can already start loading on the next cars. So here comes L83, the local out of Gadsden. It has 2 empties to replace the 2 loads that are at ADM. Now, if you look back over here at Southern States, they have 2 empties that are ready to be pulled, and train L62 has 2 loads that had arrived previously that are ready to take their place. So they'll place the 2 loads in exchange for the 2 empties. Here in the middle, you have train 409, the one that had departed from Carrollton with 2 empties going into Gadsden Yard. So those 2 cars that I considered in Gadsden Yard were 2 empties that were arriving on train 409. So you can consider this as one day, a snapshot of what's going on with all the equipment, which comes out to 12 cars. Now look what happens after that move takes place. ADM now has 4 empties on hand. And now there's 4 cars presently in Gadsden Yard with 2 loads departing on train 480. These 2 empties will represent the cars that'll go out on L83 the next day. At Southern States, L62 has placed the 2 loads for unloading and pulled the 2 empties that need to be picked up by train 409. So that's how it will end up going back to this point. Everything is set up for what happens here. So when it comes to supply chain logistics, shippers will often have a certain number of cars in their pool that will allow for extra cars to be available on hand for loading. So look at this in this case with ADM. There's 3 empties that are hanging out, or what we call in the railroad, hanging out on the lead, that are ready to be loaded. They're just surplus cars sitting there that will make their way to the loading dock. And so here's 3 more cars. And at any given time, at any switch, only 2 are actually loaded during a session. So this is like having 4 extra cars on hand. Now, as long as everything is moving, there shouldn't be any issues with the supply chain, but things can and often do go wrong. Now, disruptions in the supply chain can either be caused by the railroad itself or the customers. I'll show you both cases. When it comes to railroads, a few of the things that can cause a supply chain disruption are things like locomotive failures, or not having enough available locomotives for the service, or it could be crew shortages, not having enough available crews to perform the service, or it could just be due to traffic-related delays. Could be as a result of ongoing track work, a planned track work, or unplanned track work, or just extra business that the railroad has taken on that has caused other traffic to be delayed. Unplanned events that can cause a delay in the supply chain could be natural disasters or derailments. So these aren't expected to happen, but they can definitely have a huge impact on keeping things moving and fluid when you have to deal with a large derailment or flooding or anything that's out of your control. So how do customers actually affect the supply chain? Well, if they can't load or unload the equipment in a timely manner, they tend to build up. And customers generally only have a limited amount of track space to hold surplus equipment. So after that, it depends on the rail yards to hold it. So railroads design their rail yards with in mind that they're going to have to hold a certain amount of rail cars for their customers. But they're never designed as a storage yard for surplus cars. Let's take, for example, a shipper ships way too many cars that a receiver can unload in a timely manner. And the loads continue to build up and take up valuable space in the yard. In this case, a railroad can, and they do, issue an embargo on any other incoming traffic. It tells nobody to ship to this location until the customer can work off these loads. So let's look at another example, National Cement. Here you can see on the worksheet I completed in the last video that I needed 12 cars for one shipper and 8 cars for another shipper, since there's 2 shippers that ship out of this location, for a grand total of 20 cars. Now you can look at the trackage here, and the maximum number of cars that this track will actually hold is only 10. So what happens if they stop loading rail cars for whatever reason? There's a complete economic downturn. They're no longer able to load rail cars out. They can't hold all 10 cars on the track, and the railroad's not going to store them for them. So what do? Now, if the shipper owns or leases private equipment, such as this case in National Cement, and they've signed a lease for, say, 5 years, they've got to figure out something to do with these cars. And in this case, as often happens, they will contract with a little small short line to use some unused trackage to store the equipment until either the economy improves or the lease expires. All right, let's look at SLM Recycling in Carrollton and determine how many cars we need for the supply chain. So typically, this industry will load 1 or 2 cars per operating session. And let's just go with 2 for right now. So we take our worksheet again and load it with scrap metal. Here are the 2 car types they use, a gondola and a high side gon, ex-coal railcar. So in this case, the origin is considered the industry. That's the actual industry, is the origin. We'll have 2 here. Now the destination, in this case, because the cars are going to travel from Carrollton, they'll be picked up by train 409 out of Carrollton, go down the helix and into Gadsden, into the yard here at Gadsden. And here, they'll be interchanged to Norfolk Southern. A Norfolk Southern train will come off the interchange track and bring 2 empties in for 2 loads. So in this case, the destination is considered the interchange because it doesn't matter to us where the cars are actually eventually going to because it's located on another railroad. All we need to concern ourselves with is getting it to this point. Once we hand it off to the other railroad, it's up to them to get it there on time. So we consider the destination as the interchange. 2. Let's say there's 2 more in the yard at Gadsden, ready to come back. And then 2 on train L68 at Carrollton. So for this particular business, we need a total of 8 cars. So this is another case where these cars are private owned cars that are leased by the customer for loading. And as you can see, this track is probably only long enough to hold 3 to 4 cars at the most. So with that 8 car pool, that means 4 has to go somewhere else. So when it comes to railroad marked equipment, the railroad owner that is on the sides of the cars, in this case is Michigan Interstate, will have to store the cars on their property unless they make arrangements with another carrier. For private marked cars such as this PLCX covered hopper, if they don't have the business, the lessee or lessor is going to have to make arrangements to put them in storage. So I hope this video helped you better understand supply chain logistics when it comes to the railroad, and hopefully it helped you understand the last video on Realistic Ops Part 8 better as well. But if you have any more questions, be sure to leave them in the comment section. So I thank you for tuning in. Be sure to tune in next week on how we determine the routes for our locals. And until next time, thanks for watching everybody, and happy model railroading.